Welcome to the latest SNA Speakeasy. My name is Michael Penn, and I'll be the moderator tonight. And we have our first SNA Speakeasy from a guest who is based in Singapore. And of course, our topic is about the issue which is dominating the globe right now, which is the COVID-19 crisis. And our guest, Tom Benner, is a freelance journalist based in Singapore who has been covering this story as well as many others. A very experienced journalist. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself, Tom, before we get started?
Sure. I'm a freelance journalist, and I wear a number of hats. And one of the outlets I report for is Al Jazeera English, and I've written a number of stories about the coronavirus for them. I do other editing work. I edit at Forbes Asia and do various other things. I've been in Singapore since the fall of 2012, so it's been a while since I've been here reporting from the ground here.
Okay, well, our topic is about COVID-19 in Singapore, and well, just glancing at the headlines, it seems like this is a very timely occasion to be speaking about that topic because lots is happening just today and in the last couple of days in Singapore. So, can you please explain what are the newest developments this week and today in Singapore?
Yeah, we've had ups and downs here since the coronavirus first broke in early January. The latest is a down story. We had a record number of new cases reported on Sunday, yesterday. There were 120 new COVID-19 cases reported. That's a record for us, and that brings the total number of cases in Singapore to 1,300, and we've had 6 deaths. We were seeing most of the new cases were imported cases, people flying into Singapore because Singapore is a big transportation hub for the region. Most of the cases were people bringing the virus into Singapore from other places. But in the last days or so, last even week or so, most of the new cases have been locally transmitted. And so that has prompted the Singapore government to not put us in lockdown. They've been really resistant to put the country in lockdown for a number of reasons, but there are now some pretty extreme measures that come close to a lockdown that take place tomorrow. So we're in a downside right now. The country, when the coronavirus broke in January, I think it was first reported on December 31st. That China reported to the World Health Organization that there was this mysterious bug. On January 2nd, Singapore had a health advisory out and started checking temperatures of incoming passengers from China. And Singapore really was on the ball and really reacted quickly, lost no time. And even then, for a while, Singapore had the highest number of coronavirus cases outside of China. And so at the time, in January, things looked really bad, but the government acted quickly and was very aggressive about testing and had the capacity to test and treat and had the ability to tell people to go into self-quarantine. And so the number of cases actually had gone down dramatically to the point that it looked like the only cases that were coming in were people bringing it in from outside of Singapore. But as I said, in the past few days, past week or so, the growth has been in the locally transmitted cases. And so that's a concern. And so now we're going to be living with a whole new set of restrictions on our ability to move about. They include schools and institutes of higher learning now have to go all online. Retail establishments, anything considered non-essential, any business considered non-essential has to have everyone work from home. people can't go to restaurants anymore starting tomorrow. Restaurants are allowed to do takeout and delivery, but there's no more going out to eat, which is a big thing in Singapore. Um, the the government did a lot and really received worldwide acclaim for its response.
Okay, let me jump in there.
Yeah.
So yes, let's take this kind of chronologically then. In the early days, I mean, at the time when actually I scheduled this speakeasy with you, the main theme was looking like it was going to be why was Singapore so successful in containing COVID-19 when so many others had failed, and this story was actually once said about Japan as well.
Yeah.
But Singapore had an even more striking record in the early days.
Yeah.
And, just scanning the headlines in the early days, there was a lot of emphasis put on some sort of telephone or a mobile phone app that was used to in some way to track down the cases. And you already mentioned aggressive testing. So could you kind of sketch out what was the previously successful Singapore model for dealing with it until the latest deterioration?
Well, I think a lot went into it. The first thing is that Singapore was prepared. Everyone of a certain age still remembers the SARS outbreak of 2002, 2003. When I moved here in 2012, people would talk with dread about the awful days of SARS, and there are still memories about what it did to the country, what it did to everyday lives, how schools were closed, how businesses were shut. And since then, Singapore has decided it would be ready and it would have the capacity to deal with any sort of epidemic or pandemic like that. And so Singapore has been preparing for this moment and getting its medical infrastructure ready and having the investigative ability to look into something like this as it happened. So it was prepared. And another thing is that, Singapore had to do that because Singapore is quite vulnerable, in particular to the coronavirus. The country has less than 6 million people. The majority are ethnic Chinese, and so there's a lot of travel back and forth. There are a lot of people with relatives in China, and the outbreak actually started just around Chinese New Year, which is the biggest time of the year for travel around here. So Singapore had to be prepared, and they had to be ready to respond, and they did. And one thing that they did was to put health first, even though it was going to hurt the economy. Singapore, at one point, I think in late January, said banned all travelers from mainland China. And Singapore really has made this a health issue. And of course, it's going to hurt the economy here. It's going to hurt the global economy, but it's really been a health issue first. So Singapore had the detection capacity. And I think a big part of that also was the contact tracing. You mentioned the app, which helps the government sort of trace people, trace where they've been. I guess, the word is aggressive. They really, anytime anyone showed symptoms and they showed up at a hospital, they were immediately tested. If it looked like they tested positive, they went straight into hospitalization. If anyone had some sort of contact with anyone who might have been infected, they were told to go into self-quarantine. The government really, and the government's contact tracing was aided by the police. The police have been a part of this, just tracking down anyone who might have been exposed, anyone who might have been exposed to someone who tested positive. And when they find those people, they investigate them. They ask them to go through the diary, tell them where they've been, and then there's CCTV to help jog memories. So Singapore really rooted out a lot of, potentially I think a lot was averted by that. It's hard to prove a negative. You can't really say, oh, well, X number of people would have contracted the disease had it not been for Singapore. But I think it's safe to say that Singapore really did get the numbers low for a long time.
Well, just to stop, I'm curious about this app. Is this something you have on your own phone? Is this something everybody has? What is this about?
No, it's an opt-in, and I think a lot of people in places like the U.S. would have issues with it. And it basically uses the Bluetooth technology, where you use your phone to to track where you've been and who you've been near. If you've been near with someone who might have shown symptoms, um, the government has a record of that. And also, when they do contact tracing and they ask you, well, where have you been and who have you seen, you might not remember everything. But if there's a record in your phone of where you've been and who you've been near, then that helps the health officials and the police to figure out who else you might have been in contact with.
Is it similar to, I don't know, in the United States when I was there, I was made familiar with a Life 360 kind of app where you can, sort of keep track of relatives or family members, where they are through their mobile phone. Is that the kind of app that it
Yeah, I
is?
don't know. I don't have it, and it's an opt-in thing, and I think not everyone uses it. It's not universal. And as I said, there are people who don't want the government to know
Yeah, of course.
where they are at all times. There's another app, but technology is being employed, and there's another app that tells you, where, when the parks are crowded, when the parks are empty, when the supermarket is crowded, when the supermarket is empty. Because now that we're under this um, not quite lockdown,
Mm.
you're still allowed to go out for exercise, and you're still allowed to go out to buy groceries. And there's an app that tells you, oh, well, your local supermarket is crowded right now, or if you want to go for a walk in the Botanic Gardens, there's nobody there right now, or there's a lot of people there right
Well, switching gears a little bit, I mean, Singapore obviously is a city which is built on trade and transport, and as you mentioned, it's a hub. I mean, Changi Airport is world famous, and it recently opened up a whole new section, which is quite gotten worldwide
now.
attention. Um, how is the country faring in this era in which so much of global transportation is being shut down? Is it
Yeah.
is this something that Singapore can handle?
Well, speaking of Changi, there's a story that just broke this afternoon that Changi is going to close one of its big terminals, not the new one, but one of the terminals for the next 18 months because air traffic is down and people just aren't flying. Um, so yeah, I've interviewed restaurant owners who just they're throwing up their hands. They don't have business anymore. They don't know what's going to happen to their business. Um, and then the people who work for them obviously are losing their jobs. Um, Singapore is trying to minimize that. They're throwing all sorts of money at the problem. Financial help for employers to help them keep their employees, help to people who, just to help them with their expenses, um, their their rents. Um,
Well, on that issue, I read just in preparation for this interview that the newest package says something like 600 Singapore dollars for every adult Singaporean, and also like 75% of wage support for businesses to keep their employees, so they can pay 75% of the amount. Is that basically, the solidarity budget which you're talking about?
yeah, yeah, they're really trying to minimize the impact on people and help them to get through this. Um, and they've been saying all along, they've been really honest and open about the risks and what could happen and what is happening. Their education has been really, really strong and open and forthright. They've had all sorts of PSAs, public service announcements, and when the prime minister goes on TV, which is fairly frequently, these days. He explains in very sober, realistic tones what's happening and what's going on. And as I said, they wanted to avoid a lockdown because that makes the that's harder on people in general. I think 85% of Singaporeans live in high-rise public housing. So to be told you have to stay in your flat is really confining. And to have a lockdown is really limiting, or really hurts the economy because now people can't go out and spend their money. But I have to say, I think Singapore itself has done what it can and is doing what it can. But I think the message didn't quite come across to everyone that you really shouldn't be going out. You really need to stay home. You really have to stop. You really need to social distance yourself and stop, hanging out with people, stop visiting people. And now that we have the most recent restrictions of this not quite lockdown, I get the sense that there's a feeling that there's a little bit of a frustration that people haven't taken this more seriously. I think a lot of people have just sort of, Singapore got all this praise. Oh, it's on top of the situation, and I think people in general are trust the government, and because the government is very efficient, it's very technocratic. I think a lot of people just sort of thought, oh, well, the government's on this. I'm going to go out and go to the bar and socialize with friends. And I think the message didn't come across strong enough. And now that we have an increase in cases that are locally transmitted, now that's why the government had to take this extra step of really encouraging people basically to stay home, except for when they need to get out for groceries or for exercise.
One debate which is starting to open up here in Japan is whether or not the economic support measures are going to be directed to foreign nationals in Japan as equally to Japanese nationals. Is there a similar debate in Singapore? Do you have any idea if foreigners who are working in Singapore will be treated in a same or similar manner as Singaporean citizens?
Yeah, I don't think we know that for sure. Of the big spike in cases that was announced on Sunday, there were 2 dormers where foreign workers live that were considered new hotspots, new clusters, as they call them. And so, in addition to treating the foreign workers who tested positive, they are putting the foreign workers who live there, which is about 20,000 people, into 2-week quarantine in their rooms. They just have to stay in their rooms. The government has been good about picking up the tab for all of these tests and hospitalizations, and I assume that these foreign workers will still get their pay. But it's sort of a part of Singapore that a lot of people don't realize, that there's a huge number of migrant labor here, migrant laborers, who are part of the economy. The people who come from South Asia to build the buildings, to build the new subway lines, to dig the ditches, to do all the manual labor. There's quite a few here, and now that this story has come out about the dormitories where they live being a new hotspot, there's a renewed attention on how they live in crowded situations, and a lot of them complain it's not sanitary, it's not hygienic. So that's an issue, how foreign workers are treated, and I don't think we know yet how if they'll be dealt with fairly. I assume they will. There also are a lot of domestic workers here, women who work as helpers, housekeepers, and they've been encouraged not to. A lot of them just congregate in places on Sundays, which is traditionally their one day off, and they've been encouraged not to go to these malls that they normally go to congregate in big groups. But it's not just them; it's everyone who's being told to avoid big groups.
Maybe in the future, if we do a follow-up, we can take a look at this issue and see, how the foreigners in Singapore were in the end treated during this crisis.
Yeah.
So I guess last question from me is, socially speaking, I mean, aside from the headlines and what we're reading in the newspapers, when you're talking to your neighbors or or talking to your friends and having conversations, what's the general mood there? Are people fearful, hopeful? Do they just kind of resigned? I mean, what's the general mood that you're getting from the people of Singapore about the whole COVID-19 issue?
I think people are just trying to cope. I'm I'm personally astounded. I have to get my morning exercise. I have to walk now. I can't go to our pool at the college where I live because the pool has been closed down. Um, so I walk a lot in the morning and by myself and avoid, getting close to people. But I'm astounded at how many people still don't get it. They still, sit in clusters and sit in groups and don't keep a distance of at least 1 meter from each other. I think some people feel that way, that not everyone is getting the message. Um, people are, yeah, sure, people are, I think, concerned and maybe privately more fearful than they let on. But yeah, it's a scary time. It's a scary time.
Well, before we move on to the patron question and answer section of the event, is there any final point which you'd like to make that I haven't asked you about yet?
I guess just that, I talked to friends elsewhere in the world, and at first they were concerned that I was in Singapore because we had the second highest number of cases outside of China, and then lately it seems like it's a safe place to be, which I'm grateful for, and I'm grateful that there's a government here that's been on top of this as opposed to, a government that's been like what we have in the U.S., a government that at first was in denial and claimed this was some sort of a hoax and didn't move fast enough. And I think that's a lesson for us all, that we need to believe in science and we need to prepare for these kind of things because they do happen. And I think Singapore is a lot better off because they were prepared.
All right. So now we're going to open it up to the questions from our SNA patrons. Those